Hi, my name's Chris Tidmarsh and you find yourself here with me today at West Coast Dealing School in Las Vegas. With this video, we're going to take a look at the oversized chip rule, minimum raises, and the 50% rule which forces the minimum raise. Let's begin with the oversized chip rule. When a player uses a single large denomination chip or even multiple large denomination chips to make a bet following a previous bet, there is often confusion as to whether a player has called or raised the previous bet. This video aims to provide method and reasoning so you can understand when to consider a bet as just simply a call of the previous bet or a raise of the previous bet. It will be easier to understand if we take a look at this scenario with chips at the table. Let us first explain what is meant by the term oversized chip. Assuming we are playing a no-limit Texas Hold'em poker game with the blinds set at 100 and 200, if the first player to act after the big blind was to place a single 1,000 value chip into the pot without first making any verbal or physical gesture to suggest that he wanted to raise, then this bet would simply be considered a call of the previous bet. Even though the value of the chip is 5 times greater than the 200 that the player on the big blind has bet, because the 1,000 bet by player 3 is a single chip, it is simply considered a call. This is what is meant by the oversized chip. And here is the explanation why this is only considered to be a call. When faced with a situation where chips are placed into the pot with a greater value to those bet by a previous player, if you are unsure as to whether this is simply a call of the previous bet or a raise of the previous bet, then follow this procedure. The first thing to do is to remove one chip from the chips placed into the pot by the player who is acting on the previous bet. This should be the smallest value chip. In this particular case, I only have one chip. So after removing that chip, if you do not leave behind enough chips to equal the bet made by the previous player, and here we are leaving nothing behind, then the entire bet can only be considered a call of the previous bet. Therefore, a portion of that oversized chip was needed to match the bet of the previous player, and the difference in value will be returned to the player as change. In this case, 800 will be returned. Let's just look at this scenario using multiple chips to demonstrate this clearly. Let's suppose a player makes a bet of 1,200. He places one 1,000 chip and two 100 chips into the pot. We are post-flop in a Texas Hold'em poker game, and this is the first bet of the round. The second player silently places two 1,000 chips into the pot. So the question is this a call or is this a raise? It is clearly 800 more in value from the previous bet, so we might consider this to be a raise based on the 50% to be a raise rule. But this bet is actually just a call of the previous bet. For those of you who do not understand the 50% to be a raise rule, we will take a look at that rule toward the end of this video. So let's just take a look at why that is. Facing the bet of 1,200 by the previous player, the next player places two 1,000 chips forward. Using the method previously outlined, if we were to remove one of those chips from the bet, and this should be the smallest chip, and in our case they are both the same size so it doesn't matter which, what we leave behind must at least call or equal the bet, for us to consider the bet as anything other than a call. Here we can see I only leave 1,000 behind, and this does not equal the previous bet. So in this instance, the combination of chips together will only be considered to be a call of the previous bet. Technically, I needed one 1,000 chip to call the 1,000 chip of the previous bet, and the other 1,000 chip to call the two 100 chips. It's technically the same thing as making a 200 bet with two 100 chips, and the following player placing one 1,000 chip to call it, as outlined in the first example. So at this stage, I would just like to introduce the 50% to be a raise rule. This rule basically states that if a player adds an additional amount of chips to the value of at least 50% of the previous bet or raise amount, then that player should be forced to complete the raise to the full 100% raise. Let's take a look on the table as to what this means. So to outline the rule and see it in pictures, let me just explain that scenario using chips. If the first player to bet after the flop makes a bet of 1200, then if the next player were to accidentally and silently place 1800 into the pot, thinking he was simply calling the bet, then the dealer should verify the bet to consider if the bet is legal and correct. If you are unsure if a bet is just a call or should be considered to be a raise, a good idea here is to set aside chips sufficient in value to call the bet of the previous player. So go ahead and place 1200 in one pile and spread the additional chips to the side for consideration. If there are enough chips to equal 50% or more of the previous bet or raise increments, then this bet would officially be a raise. It is currently incomplete, but the player is obliged to complete this bet to a full minimum raise because the extra 50% or more of chips force this particular bet to become a raise. That is the 50% to be a raise rule. However, in this scenario, that 50% extra only applied because we had multiple smaller denomination chips within the bet, which allowed us to remove one of them, leaving sufficient chips behind to at least call the previous bet. Once we established that we had sufficient chips to call, plus extra chips, then all of the extra chips can now be assessed, and if they total 50% or more of the previous bet or raise increments, then this would need to be completed to a full raise. If we did not have at least 50% extra in chips for the previous bet or raise increment, so let's suppose we only had 500 extra, then any additional chips less than 50% in value would simply be returned to the player, and the dealer would declare this as a call. So, let's just run that scenario one more time to clarify it. And remember, the oversized chip rule can apply to bets with just one chip or multiple chips. If the first bet made is 200 in value, and the next player silently throws out a 1000 value chip, if you are not sure if this is a call or a raise, remember to remove one chip from the bet. Having done this, you must leave at least enough chips behind to call the bet being faced. And in this case, we leave nothing behind. So this will only be deemed a call, using the oversized chip rule. If a player makes a first bet of 1200, the next player puts out one 1000 chip and 6 100 chips. First, you should remove one chip, the smallest one, and if you leave behind sufficient chips to at least call the bet, then you might consider this bet to be a raise, provided the additional chips are sufficient to meet the 50% extra rule. In this case, the additional chips are only 400 in value. That's less than 50% of the 1200 increment, so in this case, this bet is still only a call, and the additional chips will be pushed back to the player. If the additional chips were 600 or more in value, then the player would be informed to complete the bet to the minimum raise, making a bet of 2400. This being a raise of 1200. The current raise increment at this time is 1200. We will look at how to establish the raise increment in a moment. Remember, the player could not raise to any other amount as he is committed to the minimum raise, having applied at least 50% extra with his first bet. Making an additional motion or declaration with chips beyond 2400 would be considered a string raise, and string bets and raises are not permitted in poker. More about string bets in another video. So, finally with this video, I would just like to clarify what you should consider as a minimum raise and how to determine the minimum raise increment. Often it is misunderstood and players and dealers think that you simply double the previous bet to establish the minimum raise, and this is just not true. Here's how you should consider bets and raises and what you should look for when establishing the current raise increment. If we were post-flop in a Texas Hold'em game and the first player to act makes a bet of 1,000, it would be fair and true to say that the next player to minimum raise would have to bet 2,000. But this is not because you simply double the previous bet. This is because you should first consider that the next player has to at least call the bet he faces to stay in the game. And if he wishes to raise, then he must apply the current raise increment on top of the amount that he needed to call. The current raise increment at the moment is 1,000 because this bet was the first bet made in the current round, and so it went from 0, no bet on the table, to 1,000, making a difference of 1,000, and so creating the current raise increment. The difference between 0 and 1,000 sets that raise increment. So this is where the confusion comes from, because in this instance, it does appear that you are doubling the previous bet. So let's just clarify this. Let's suppose that player 2 chooses to make a raise and bets 2,200. That is a raise of 1,200 from the 1,000 initially bet by the first player. So the new raise increment now is 1,200, not 1,000. The difference between 2,200 and the previous bet of 1,000 is 1,200 and is now the new raise increment. So for player 3 to raise the minimum, he would need to bet 3,400 and not 4,400 as lots of people think. Remember, he needs to call 2,200 if he would like to remain in the game. But should he wish to raise, the minimum permitted is to add the new raise increment of 1,200 on top of the 2,200, making a total of 3,400. Of course, this is a no-limit game, so a player can bet more than this. We are just talking about minimum raises here. The minimum raise rule applies to all betting structures, whether it be no limit, pot limit, limit or spread limit. So if player 3 made the bet of 3,400, then the raise increment did not change. This means should the next player wish to minimum raise, he only needs to call 3,400 and add the 1,200 raise increments on top, making a total bet of 4,600. So, just to recap on our previous lesson using the oversized chip rule and the 50% to be a raise rule, if player 3 was to make that raise to 3,400 and player 4 throws out 4 times 1,000 chips, this would be a call because if I remove one of those chips, I do not leave enough behind to call the bet that is faced. Even though the bet of 4,000 has an additional 600 value, which is 50% of the raise increment, the oversized chip rule and procedure applies here. Removing one chip from the total bet does not leave enough to call the bet we face, so we can declare this to be a call. But if the player throws out 3 1,000 chips and 2 500 chips, then this will be a raise. Again, using the oversized chip rule and procedure, if I remove one 500 chip and so do leave 3,500 in chips behind, then this does cover the bet being faced. So when I return that 500 chip to the bet and consider the whole 4,000, now I do actually have 600 more than the bet I face, and this is 50% of the current raise increment. Therefore, this player would be obliged to complete the bet to 4,600. Under tournament rules, this player has no choice and is compelled to complete the raise, provided he has chips available. Should that player believe he can fold his hand and forfeit the chips, he would be subject to a tournament penalty. Of course, in a cash game, house rules apply, and most card rooms would allow a player to fold and forfeit the chips should the player wish to do so. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more videos just like this one. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on our YouTube channel or visit us at westcoastdealingschool.com. Our goal is to make poker games more fun and easier to play and deal.